This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 315 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Things got back on track last week, and thank God they did. I was all over the Jared Goff bad game. I like Deebo Samuel as a deeper wide receiver play. Christian Kirk came through. Tyler Lockett didn't have a great game even before his injury, and LaShawn McCoy didn't even play. There were some misses, like Gus Edwards being a potential deep play at running back, but it was a much better week than week 9. Now, before looking at some players that I like more and less than the consensus for this week, I wanted to let you guys know about FanDuel's $800,000 NFL Thursday night special. For $9, you can build a lineup using Steelers and Browns players, so players from the Thursday night game, and have a shot at the $200,000 first place prize. Again, that's just for $9. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. If I'm being honest, there's not a whole lot to disagree with against the consensus rankings this week at quarterback. But I do like Kyle Allen as this week's top streamer, or at least this week's top traditional streamer. So I'll kick things off with him. Atlanta's defense this past week was good against New Orleans, but the larger sample size still tells us that they're very beatable. They rank 5th worst in pressure rate, 2nd worst in sack rate, and 4th worst in yards per attempt allowed. Quarterbacks against Atlanta in fantasy football are also averaging 3.5 more points per game versus their season-long average. The game in Charlotte has a high over-under, and the Panthers are pretty big favorites, which gives them an implied team total of over 27 points. This is a great spot for Kyle Allen. And Derek Carr's in a good spot as well. A lot of fantasy managers get nervous when their quarterbacks are facing bad teams, and as a result, are big favorites. But in order to get that lead, the team needs to score points. The Raiders will need Derek Carr to get to a double-digit lead. They've got an implied team total of 29.5 points this week, which is the highest in the league. And like Atlanta, Cincinnati's allowing 3.5 fantasy points above expectation this year. So Carr should be projected to perform better than he has throughout the season. Now, one player I wanted to touch on today was Baker Mayfield. I'm not in love with him as a play. As I talked about on the 10 Trend show yesterday, the Steelers have allowed just a little over 10 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks since trading for Minkah Fitzpatrick. It's a matchup that you generally want to avoid. But I do think that people are just a little bit too low on Mayfield. That doesn't make him a great play, so don't take this the wrong way, but I'm slightly higher than the consensus on him this week, as weird as it is given the splits that I talked about with the Steelers and Minkah Fitzpatrick. Mayfield's played a pretty tough schedule this year, and he's ranked better than QB 10 in a single week exactly 0 times. But over the last 2 weeks, Cleveland's faced Denver and Buffalo. Those are 2 teams that rank really well against the pass in general and in adjusted fantasy points allowed. And Mayfield wasn't terrible in those matchups. Now, Pittsburgh's right there with those 2 teams. They've actually been better than Denver and Buffalo with Minkah. And the pressure that they can generate scares the hell out of me if I were to play Baker. But don't forget, Mayfield is also a positive touchdown regression candidate. Based on his yardage total, and I like to talk about this every episode, but yards correlate to touchdowns, but based on that total, he should have almost 5 more touchdowns than he currently has. So simply using his 2019 performances from a fantasy perspective and saying this will happen again isn't necessarily the best process in the world. Now, his floor is 0 points. I mean, he could be terrible on Thursday night. You may be listening to this on Friday laughing at me for even suggesting that he's undervalued this week. But he's been in tough spots all season long, and ranking him at QB 21 just seems a tad bit low. I think he's more of a mid-range QB2 rather than a low-end one, but I'd still absolutely be playing someone like Kyle Allen or Derek Carr over him. I honestly think that you can make the argument that Baker should be played over Jared Goff. At the very least, the gap between the 2 players shouldn't be as significant as it currently is. Like I talked about last week, Goff has been strong in 4 games this year, ranking QB 8 or higher in those contests. And he has a QB 12 performance as well. But against the Panthers, the Browns, the 49ers, and now the Steelers, he's really struggled. And each of those teams rank in the top half of the league in pressure rate. And what does he get this week? The Bears, who are 5th best in pressure rate this year. I'm worried about the offensive line, and I think that we could see a low-scoring game in this one. And don't forget, when we saw Goff against the Bears last year, he threw for 180 yards with 4 interceptions. In my opinion, he should be benched this week. Sam Darnold's a deeper streamer this week for those of you who may not be able to get someone like Kyle Allen, but his range of outcomes is pretty scary. That's why I think he's ranked too high at QB 16. Now, Washington's been pretty average against opposing quarterbacks, but the entire goal of their offense is to slow things down and be methodical with their run game. It's highly unlikely that we see a shootout in this game. Quarterbacks have averaged just 22 pass attempts per contest over their last 3 games versus Washington. So sure, Darnold can provide some fantasy points, but you're really banking on efficiency here, and it's just really hard to trust that given how Sam Darnold has performed this year. Carson Wentz in a tough matchup is ranked below Sam Darnold, but I would actually go with someone like Carson Wentz instead of Darnold. Brian Hill was a hot waiver wire ad this week given the Devonta Freeman injury, and he's most definitely in play in Week 11. Carolina's allowing the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, and even when you adjust for their opponents, they still rank 4th worst. And Hill honestly might end up being somewhat of a workhorse for Atlanta. Last week, he saw 64.5% of Atlanta's running back carries and a 6.3% target share. And that was with Devonta Freeman getting 32% of the team's carries and a 12.5% target share. So Hill should be in your lineup this week as an RB2. And the same goes for Austin Eckler. Yes, he was a sell candidate for me this week on the 15 Transactions show. But on that show, I mentioned this matchup against Kansas City. It's a juicy one. The Chiefs are allowing the 2nd highest adjusted fantasy points to opposing running backs this year, where they're giving up over 6 more points per game versus expectation to team running backs. So obviously Melvin Gordon is going to get a chunk of that, but Austin Eckler should as well. And I'm interested to see what happens if Kansas City gets a lead in this game. They're not massive favorites, but we know it's possible. Eckler's seen his snap share dip below 50% in both the Chargers' last 2 games, but they ran 0 plays while trailing in one of those contests, and they ran 45 plays in a neutral game script in another. So the scripts have favored Melvin Gordon a little bit over their last 2 contests. Regardless, though, Eckler's a good RB2 for you this week. Now, if Matt Breida isn't able to go, I like Raheem Mostert as a deeper play. Breida was actually able to do some damage against Arizona the last time these 2 teams faced off against one another, which seems like it was basically yesterday. And Mostert got some run against the Seahawks on Monday night. He finished the game with a 24% running back rush share, and he was playing all the snaps in overtime. So if Breida's out, or if there are reports of him being limited, I think Mostert's in play. Now on the flip side, let's talk about Todd Gurley. The Bears have allowed the 2nd most receptions to running backs. That might make Gurley a decent play this week, but it's tough to trust a receiving matchup for a running back who's playing on a team that's targeted running backs at the lowest rate in football this year. Like I said on yesterday's show, Gurley's become a touchdown-dependent fantasy asset. And while he can still find your lineup this week, I'm not nearly as bullish as the consensus. They have him as a top 20 running back. I could see this Rams-Bears game being ugly. And then there's Sony Michel. Guys, in games where Sony Michel hasn't found the end zone this year, he's ranked as the RB 71, 45, 22, 37, and 43. He's basically worthless without a touchdown. And that may be hard to come by against Philadelphia because the Eagles have allowed the 2nd fewest rushing yards to running backs this year. So maybe Michel scores at the goal line, but as you guys know, I'm not a fan of banking on touchdowns week in and week out. In some cases, depending on your depth, Michel can be benched this week. I've got mostly deep plays for you guys at wide receiver this week, starting with the least deep of the 4, and that's my man Marquise Brown. He's currently ranked as wide receiver 27 this week, but the matchup is there. Houston has allowed 6.5 more fantasy points per game this year than they should have, given their opponent's wide receiver team averages. That's the 2nd highest mark in the league behind only Tampa Bay, who really sucks at defending wideouts. But the Texans have given up the 8th most air yards this season as well. That obviously bodes well for a deep threat like Hollywood Brown. And Hollywood himself has seen 17% or more of Baltimore's targets in every single game played this year. And that target share could yield more targets if the Ravens are forced to throw the ball more. And that could be the case in this game. Baltimore's 2nd to last across the league in pass attempts this year, but Houston's defense has faced the 6th most pass attempts. So I'm into Hollywood as a wide receiver 2 this week, but he's being ranked as a wide receiver 3. Deebo Samuel's in play again too, even if we see Emmanuel Sanders and George Kittle. Now obviously if those guys are sidelined, I like Deebo even more. But he had been seeing an increase in usage over his last few games heading into week 10. That's why I liked him last week. And then in week 11, he had a 25% target share and he had over 100 receiving yards against the Seahawks. He was very clearly the best wide receiver for San Francisco once Emmanuel Sanders left that game. The matchup against Arizona is an above average one, and Samuel should be in line for some work regardless of those injuries. That's just where things have trended. Now, Randall Cobb had a big game last week, but I think it could happen again in week 11. Maybe not that big of a game, but a strong one. He's now seen a 23% and an 18% target share over his last 2 games, and he'll get a Detroit defense this week that hasn't been very good against slot receivers. According to data compiled from Pro Football Focus, over 35% of targets against Detroit this year have gone to the slot. That's the 4th highest rate in the league. They've also allowed 10 slot touchdowns, which ties them for the most in football. Cobb's played nearly 90% of his snaps from the slot this season, so he's going to benefit from this matchup. And my deepest of deep plays this week is Russell Gage. Now hear me out for a minute. Gage has stepped in for Mohamed Sanu over the Falcons' last 2 games, and he's actually averaged 7 targets per game. He's seen a target share of 18.4% and 15.6% over his last 2 games. That's pretty decent. And against the Panthers this week, the matchup isn't all that bad, especially with Austin Hooper sidelined. Carolina's been average at stopping opposing wide receivers this year, but specifically, they've watched about 35% of their targets against them go to the slot. Gage has played 79% of his snaps from that area of the field over the last 2 games without Sanu. So he's a very intriguing waiver wire option that you can just plug into your lineup. DJ Chark was someone who caught my eye as being overvalued this week. He should still be in your lineup, don't get me wrong, but he was the wide receiver 11 on Fantasy Pros. And I was kind of shocked by that. Indianapolis has been a pretty average matchup on paper this year, and they've actually seen just 51% of the targets against them go to wide receivers. That's sort of a continuation of last year too, but that's one of the lower marks in the league. Jacksonville has Nick Foles under center now, which means we don't exactly know how things will go for that offense. And they've got an implied team total of just 20.5 points this week. Now, DJ Chark is fine, like I said, and he should be in your lineup, but wide receiver 11 is pretty high. Straight up, though, I'm not very into Larry Fitzgerald this week. Like, you can probably bench him. He's averaged about a 16% target share over his last 4 games after hitting the 23% mark over his first 6. So things are trending down. But he's also facing San Francisco, a team allowing over 8 fantasy points below expectation this year to opposing team wide receivers, and they've been especially good against the slot. Just 23% of targets have gone to that area of the field against San Francisco, and they've surrendered just 1 slot touchdown all year long. So like I said, I think that you could bench Larry Fitzgerald. Kyle Rudolph is a strong streaming option this week. He's still available on a lot of waiver wires, and he's surprisingly finished as the tight end 3, 11, and 4 in 3 of his last 4 games. But he's also seen a target share north of 10.7% in each of his last 5. And if Adam Thielen is out again, that could and should continue. So he's more of a volume play than anything else. In that same game between the Vikings and Broncos, though, is Noah Fant. And I sort of regret not talking about Fant on the 10 Trends show yesterday, because without Emmanuel Sanders this season, Fant's seen a 27.6% and a 22.2% target share in that Broncos offense. Those are high numbers. He'll face Minnesota this week, which looks like a tough matchup on paper. They've allowed the 10th fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends. However, they're the only team in the NFL that hasn't allowed a tight end touchdown this year. So those numbers are kind of skewed. They've actually allowed the 7th most yards to the tight end position. So I like Noah Fant as a deeper play. I talked about the Oakland Raiders on the 15 Transactions show this week, but I think that they're in play as big favorites against the Bengals. You guys already heard the reasons why, despite the fact that they've gotten to opposing quarterbacks at a pretty low rate this year. But if you want another deep play, I think Washington could be it. The Jets have been sacked at the 2nd highest rate this season, and while that's not all on Sam Darnold, Darnold's been sacked an average of 3 times per game since he's returned to action. He's also thrown 8 picks in those 4 games. This game itself looks to be a low-scoring one with an over-under that's south of 40 points, and that means that Washington likely won't just sink your team. So I think that they're fine this week as a streaming option. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you tomorrow with the weekly mailbag show.